This video is a discussion about gender identity, gender expression, and Bill C-279. The position I'm going to be taking in this video is not a popular one. It's a politically incorrect position. Nevertheless, it is important for Canada to have an honest discussion, and a discussion requires that both sides of an issue be heard. My position is motivated by the command to love my neighbor as myself. I am very concerned for the health of our society, the safety of our children, and the well-being of those who identify as transsexual or transgendered. This video and my opinions are not motivated by bigotry, by hatred, or by any sort of evil animus. Rather, I recognize that each and every individual is created imago Dei, in the image of God, and therefore have inherent worth and must be treated with dignity and respect. So let's begin.
Here is a roadmap of where I want to go in this discussion. I want to begin by explaining what Bill C-279 is, and also explain what the Judeo-Christian view of gender is. For those of you watching this video who do not subscribe to such a worldview, I encourage you to please consider watching the entire video, as my discussion includes arguments from a public policy perspective as well as a medical and a legal perspective. After that introduction, I will explain what my two chief concerns are about Bill C-279. Once I've explained those concerns, I will discuss and answer 3 objections to my position. I will wrap up with a few suggestions of what you can do to support a proper approach to gender identity in public policy. So, let's begin. On June 6, 2012, Bill C-279 passed second reading in the House of Commons and was referred to Standing Committee for further study. This bill, if passed into law, will add the terms gender identity and gender expression to both the Canadian Human Rights Act and to the Criminal Code as additional prohibited grounds of discrimination. Both of these terms are undefined in the bill, but they would, simply put, protect the right for a person to either express themselves or identify as being male, female, neither, or both, regardless of what their sex assigned at birth is.
So, how do we respond? How do we talk about such a sensitive issue in a nation that seems so confused about sexuality? Now, controversies and debates about gender define much of today's cultural landscape. If you take away all of the debates about gender and gender roles and sexuality, our world would probably be a much quieter place. Nevertheless, the world that we know is a world that's increasingly in revolt against the idea that gender is assigned by our Creator and is thus a fixed category.
We face a clear choice. We will see the binary understanding of gender, as either male or else female, as being a gift from God revealed throughout creation, or we will see it as a socially constructed reality, one that we can and perhaps should deconstruct. So, are we bound to these categories, male and female, by a creator through his laws of biology? Or did we do this whole gender thing to ourselves? Now, the Christian worldview is very clear on this point. The Bible presents gender as part of the goodness of creation. God reveals His glory in every aspect of creation, and this is abundantly true with respect to the two sexes. God glorifies Himself in creating humanity in His own image, both male and female. So to deny that, or to confuse this distinction, is to deny God the glory that is His due.
While Christians must see persons struggling with gender confusion as those who deserve our care, our compassion, and our concern, the worldview of the Bible leaves no allowance for confusion about gender or about sex change procedures, for example. Transgenderism and transsexualism are evidence of just how confused human beings can be. The demand that we be allowed to make ourselves in our own image is central to the modern cult of self-expression and personal autonomy. So we must respond to Bill C-279 and explain to our MP and to our community that it must be rejected by Parliament. Here are two practical policy reasons why Bill C-279 should be rejected.
First of all, the terms in question are unlike the other terms in the list. These new terms do not represent particular objective conditions, whether those biologically determined, like sex or race for example, or those characteristics determined by association with recognizable social institutions, terms including national origin, marital status, or religion. These first two sets of terms are both objectively measurable. But what these new terms represent are subjective or subjectively determined conditions, mere attitudes towards oneself, or attitudes combined with behaviors like cross-dressing or elective surgery. So good law and sound public policy cannot be built on the shifting sands of the subjective, on the shifting sands of personal feelings or emotions.
If we do, there will be large-scale implications for Canadian law and public policy that have not yet been properly examined. In fact, there is currently a raging debate about this issue in both medicine and in psychiatry, even though the spheres of politics and the media seem to be silent on this reality. Regardless, this bill will do much more than create special rights for special people. It will entrench in Canadian law the notion that sex and gender are basically social constructs, products of a series of human choices based not in the natural order, but in more or less arbitrary acts of interpretation.
My second concern is the vagueness of the bill. Even those people in the LGBTQQ2SIA community who have championed this bill disagree on the parameters of the protection. We can only assume that gender-related identity and gender-related expression should also include protection for gender-related behavior, regardless of the individual's assigned sex when born. Which begs the question, just what behavior will this bill protect? Shall a male who self-identifies as a female be allowed in the ladies' room, for example? Only post-surgery? Pre-surgery? Simply as a cross-dresser? Alternatively, shall businesses and schools and universities and churches and hospitals be forced to supply unisex washrooms in addition to their separate sex washrooms? And even if they did, will a biological male identifying as a female on Friday nights and every other Sunday afternoon, will he or she feel offended to have to use a unisex washroom and not the female-only washroom? Or will Christian schools have to do away with male and female uniforms in order to avoid insisting on the wrong clothes for certain people?
Now, perhaps you are thinking, come on, Andre, it won't get that bad. You're overreacting, or you're just fear-mongering, trying to scare us or shock us into working against Bill C-279. Well, I was recently made aware of the new Toronto District School Board's guidelines for the accommodation of transgender and gender non-conforming students and staff. I'm just going to read directly from it for you. On page 7, it says this, quote, "All students have the right to use a washroom that corresponds to the student's gender identity, regardless of the student's sex assigned at birth. Requiring students to prove their gender by requiring a doctor's note, identity documents, etc. is not acceptable. A student's self-identification is the sole measure of the student's gender." And on page 11, it says the same thing for employees. In the end, quote, "The employee's self-identification is the sole measure of their gender."
Now, I believe that most Canadians are decent folk, but the reality of humanity is that there will be some who abuse this purely subjective notion of gender. It creates the perfect alibi for perverts.
If all you need to gain access to a woman's public washroom is a personal declaration that you belong there, then surely this can and will be abused. Are we willing to risk our children for political correctness? But this goes beyond vulnerable women and children.
Shall doctors and surgeons be required to do sex change operations in violation of their own principles and oaths? And what will be the impact on freedom of religion or freedom of conscience? And what will be the economic impact? Shall our overstretched public healthcare systems be required to provide very expensive surgeries and the associated therapies for those who choose them? In fact, this is already happening. You see, the subjective vagueness of these undefined terms demand that this bill be defeated. We need forethought, we need prudence, we need courage, not political correctness from the people's representatives in dealing with this bill. We must urge every MP to vote against Bill C-279.
Now, here are 3 objections you may hear supporting the inclusion of these terms in our law. First, something like this. Why don't you support equal protection of all humans regardless of how they identify? Surely you, as a Christian, would be against hate crime. My response is this. First of all, the question or the objection assumes that people who identify as transsexual are not protected until they're added to the list. But that assumption is false. They are protected. In fact, they are already protected twice. First, they're protected by the term sexual orientation, as that fact has been conceded by the Canadian Human Rights Commission and by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. But much more fundamentally, justice is blind and should be administered regardless of who someone is or who they think they are. Every Canadian is equally protected under the law. For example, assault is wrong, period. Why would it be more wrong or less wrong to assault a man because he is a man who identifies as a woman than to randomly assault someone for no reason at all? Furthermore, there are many other identifiable groups not listed in the law. People with red hair, for example. Do they lack the protection of the law simply because they are not listed in the law? Obviously not. So, the argument that this change is necessary to bring about equal protection fails. A second objection goes something like this. Our government should recognize this group of people. In this way, they will feel included.
Public policy should not be based on personal feelings or subjective notions. It has to be based on objective, measurable criteria. The law can and ought only to recognize people for who they are, not for who they think they are.
How many of you played Cowboys and Indians when you were young? Well, if you now, as an adult, chose to identify as an Aboriginal, you would not be able to convince the government to reduce your taxes because you think you're Aboriginal. It doesn't work that way.
Bill C-279 in this sense is incredibly radical. Many of those who support it don't realize how much it fundamentally alters public policy. It creates a precedent in public policy that says gender is purely subjective, and thus any identifying characteristic, gender, ethnicity, age, certain types of disability, that they're purely subjective.
A third objection goes something like this. How would these people, transsexuals and transgendered people, how would they feel if we excluded them, if we said we weren't going to add them to the law? It says that we don't love them and that we think less of them. Christians should love everybody.
Christians must demonstrate love for their neighbors, and that's exactly what motivates our opposition to this bill. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that sex changes and other means of accommodating this type of behavior does more harm than good.
Let's consider apotemnophilia, for example. Apotemnophilia is sexual arousal based on the image or fantasy of oneself as an amputee. Now, there are thousands of documented cases around the world in which otherwise sane and rational individuals express a very strong and specific desire for the amputation of a healthy limb or limbs.
So, what would the loving option be here? To indulge the individual, to accommodate their desire by amputating a healthy limb, or to treat the disorder? How loving is it then to embrace or affirm something that was once seen as harmful? Gender reassignment surgery is a huge social scientific experiment where we are removing and adding body parts based on how a person feels. Only in 2011 has there finally been a comprehensive study done on the effects of these types of procedures. A Swedish study concluded as follows. Persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, for suicidal behavior, and for psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Let's work to end the madness of political correctness. Here's how you can help make a difference.
First, consider calling, visiting, or writing to your MP. All members of Parliament need to hear from their constituents. If they do not hear anything, they will vote as they feel like voting. And right now, popular pressure is for them to vote for Bill C-279. Secondly, I hope that you can engage your neighbors and your co-workers on this issue. Many people have not had the time or the luxury to think through all of the ramifications of this bill. Help them to see the bigger problems with this type of language and this approach. Help them to understand what the fallout can be. Third, part of that engaging your culture would be to consider writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. This is a free way to engage your society and is very effective. All of this should be done in the context of prayer. For those of you who understand the Bible to be a handbook for our lives, I hope that you can pray so that God might bring about a proper understanding of gender in this country.
Thank you for watching this video, and thanks for your attention. I hope that you will engage on this very politically sensitive issue and that God might bless your efforts. Take care.